Hey guys, it's Chad with the Unsuitable podcast. On the season 1 finale, Mary B is in the hot seat. You know her as the regular host of this podcast, but today she is interviewed by Tiffany Owens. Mary B is a writer, speaker, and podcaster based in Manhattan. She writes and speaks about singleness and relationships, femininity, and mental health. Her work has been featured in Fathom magazine and on the Now She Rises blog. She blogs weekly at marybsafrit.com. Check out the episode description for links. Tiffany Owens is a writer, entrepreneur, and civics enthusiast. Check out her work at thisfiercecourage.wordpress.com.
How long have you lived in New York City now?
I have been here a little bit over 2 years. I moved here November 2016.
Can you tell me a little bit about that transition? Where's home for you?
So I grew up in North Carolina. I lived there pretty much my whole life. I went to college in North Carolina. I went to grad school in North Carolina. I traveled. I've been to like 22 countries. So it's not like I just lived in this tiny North Carolina bubble.
Nobody was judging you.
But
thank you for clarifying.
But I kind of
Thank you for bragging. Just plug, that was not in our notes.
I got to get street cred where I can. I'm about to talk about being unsuitable and all of that. So
she's making a plug, everybody.
Yeah, travel much and often. The transition was not bad. I'm pretty adaptable. Moving from my tiny town has like 5,000 people. We don't even live in the town. We live outside of the town on a farm. Moving straight from there to New York, it should have been, I think, a bigger adjustment than it was. I mean, I'm not going to lie. It was an adjustment the first probably week. Well, first of all, my stuff didn't arrive for, I think it was like 4 days after I did. So it was just me in my studio apartment. My mom had gotten me an air mattress. But besides that, I had like my artwork that we had driven up because we hired movers for all of the other stuff. My artwork and my keyboard and a yoga mat. And that was it.
What else do you need?
It was fine.
I once had a very large, ridiculously large, unnecessarily large mattress and a cardboard box for holding all my random stuff, which I tried to organize as aesthetically pleasing as possible. You do what you can.
Exactly.
You know?
You do what you can. Yeah. So, I mean, the first 5 days, week, 2 weeks or so was like me, like, what have I done? What have I done? I am here in New York. I don't have anything. This is just how my life is going to be for the rest of forever or whatever. Very melodramatic.
Well, I mean, it is a pretty big deal because coming to New York City for you was a big decision. Can you tell me a little bit about how that came about?
Yes, I can. So I studied music in school, and in grad school, I focused on vocal performance, which is like opera. And I knew I wanted to move to a city to pursue singing. I was thinking like maybe Philly or Boston or Chicago. But I did a 6-week opera training program in Austria the summer after I graduated from grad school and studied with a teacher while I was there who was amazing. She was American, and she teaches at Montclair State University, which is in New Jersey. And I talked to her about it and realized that this was the time. If I was going to move to New York, this was the time in my life. And the only thing that was really keeping me from taking the plunge was fear. I was afraid. And that didn't seem like a very good reason to take the opportunity to move to New York when I could, especially when I knew that I was going to have an amazing voice teacher already here and figured out. So that is why I moved to New York initially.
So walk me through some of those early days. You land here, you have your artwork, you have your yoga mat, you have your keyboard.
Mm-hmm. It was the weekend of the New York Marathon, and I lived on the east side of First Avenue. For non-New Yorkers who are listening, First Avenue is closed off, like all of it.
I think
we
need
marathon.
A street, though, just if you could make this a little bit more clear.
Exactly. Tell people exactly where I lived. 83rd.
Okay. I mean, I don't know. It could have been Lower East Side.
No. 83rd and 1st. Upper East Side is where I lived. So I didn't know if I was going to be able to cross First Avenue, and there was nothing in my apartment, and there's nothing on that side of First Avenue. So I woke up. This was like the day after my mom left, and I woke up and I was like, well, I have to get out of this apartment. It was a freakishly warm day, and I somehow miraculously crossed First Avenue and just went to Central Park, and I didn't know what to do. I didn't know anyone. And so I just kind of sat there and watched people run the New York Marathon on this like freakishly warm day in November. And I remember like every single day trying to force myself to get out of my apartment, like get out of my apartment and do something, even if it was like I was applying for jobs at the time. Even if I just went out and like got lunch somewhere and read for an extended period of time. So I wasn't just sitting in my empty apartment being like anxious and like depressed.
So before this, you were saying like you love to travel a lot, like you were very adaptable. So what was happening now? Like why was this different for you? Because it sounds like there was a lot of anxiety. It sounds like it was really scary. Like it wasn't like you were moving here for school and school started on this day and you only had 2 weeks to burn and you had to go to the container store and, get enough containers for all your things. You know, like most people when they move to New York City, well, a lot of them, they move for really structured reasons.
Right.
Whereas you just moved to pursue this goal. And so I'm sure that brought up a lot of thoughts and
so much anxiety. I didn't have a job. I had kind of a plan of like take voice lessons and do auditions and get some sort of a job somewhere. This is kind of how I operate and how I started this podcast as well, where I'm like anxious, like what am I going to do? What am I going to do? And I have an idea of what I want to do. And I'm like, I just need to do it. And I just do it. And then I like got up here to New York. I was like, okay, I'm here. I don't know what I'm doing.
So it's almost like you have this cycle.
Doing it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's like you have the anxiety spiral.
Yeah.
Then you make the big audacious decision.
Yeah.
And then the spiral starts again.
Yeah.
After you make the decision, then you make the next big audition. So you're applying for jobs, you found one, you started what you call the singer's lifestyle.
I did. I was temping for a while, and then I did what I swore I would never do, and I got back into food service, which I am out of now, and again, swearing that I am never going to do food service again, and was auditioning.
You did take those voice lessons.
I did take those voice lessons. I traveled, an hour and a half to Montclair, New Jersey to take my hour to hour and a half voice lesson, and then I came back. So it was like a full day adventure.
So you start building this lifestyle. You kind of get settled in.
Yeah.
I'm assuming you get a mattress, not just an air mattress.
Yes. My stuff did arrive. Eventually.
Okay. You eventually feel, you discover your way out of the apartment across multiple streets, not just First Avenue.
Not just First Avenue, right.
You find a job, you take your classes.
All the way to Lexington. Yeah.
Brave soul.
Yes, I know. Daring.
So all of this builds up. You go on a couple auditions. Then what happens?
I had been auditioning for a while. Oh, man. Probably like 6-8 months, not quite a year. And realized that I did not have a healthy relationship with my voice. I had all of this performance anxiety, which a lot of people have, but it was affecting my ability to even practice. Like singing alone in my apartment became too stressful for me. And so I just didn't feel like I didn't want to go on any auditions. I was just too anxious. There was just too much about the auditioning situation that you can't control. And I felt very powerless and just very like on the nihilistic side of things. Like if you're a perfectionist, you have this like, you're either highly, highly motivated or you're like, nothing matters. So I was on the nothing matters side of things. And so I just stopped auditioning one day. And, I'm singing again, but more in a fun capacity. During that time, I don't know, it was not a conscious decision. I guess I just needed a creative outlet and I just started writing. I just like started writing, and it turned into a book.
So I want to explore that, but I want to go back before we do.
Okay.
Can you bring us to the scene of when this is happening for you? Like, can you remember like a day or a moment when you were like, I'm done?
Yeah. With singing?
Yeah.
Yeah. I remember this was in my studio apartment, and my keyboard was set up right across from my bed. And I just remember doing my vocal exercises. Like, first I would start with these straw exercises, which are supposed to help with like voice placement and breathing and all sorts of stuff. And then, just doing very, very basic warm-up exercises. And probably 10 minutes in, in a very dramatic, like Disney princess sort of way, just hurled myself onto my bed. And I was like, I cannot do this. I cannot do this. I can't, in those moments, all I could think about was how much more I needed to be auditioning, how much more I needed to be learning, how much more I needed to do. And I couldn't focus on the moment, just doing what I was doing in the moment. I just could not stop thinking about everything else that was like holding me back from being able to be a successful singer.
Yeah, and I'm sure there's lots of people listening to this podcast who have had similar experiences or are in similar places,
Yeah.
of trying to pursue something, trying to pursue a goal, trying to pursue something creative, and trying to find that balance between looking at something in the moment, like that next best step, and the big picture, you know, of the entire thing they're trying to accomplish.
Right.
What would you say to someone like that who might be listening now? Now looking back on your own story, maybe you have some perspective.
Looking back on my own story. I mean, if this was not the case for me, but if like music really is that driving passion for you, you can push through it. And I see a really amazing psychiatrist now who coincidentally specializes in performance anxiety. He's amazing. But there are ways to push through it and to keep going and to just take the next step, just whatever like the next step is. There's so much that you can't control that you really need to just focus on what you bring to the table as an artist. For me, it was the right decision to take a step back and to say, you know what, I can't do this right now. I can't. And be okay with it.
Which is so interesting because a lot of people would, if they're looking at your story, they might say, oh, you gave up. But I mean, I've watched you do your work now, not just with the podcast, but also processing your identity, like you're also processing your work as a singer. And it's interesting because you made a pivot. You made this pivot into writing, and it's kind of bringing you back in a way to music and to singing.
Yeah.
And I think it's awesome that you were able to be open to that kind of creative pivot and put one thing down and pick up another. And then over time, you find this unexpected connection between the two.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks. It wasn't the most, I wouldn't call it a conscious decision even. I just physically could not bring myself to sing anymore. I'm coming back to a place where I'm singing again. And I have a different voice teacher now, someone who's in the city, so I don't have to like make it a 6-hour event if I want a voice lesson. And she's like really helping me. It's very low stakes, just helping me to get more comfortable with my voice. Because that was like one of my big struggles was I always felt like I was trying to impersonate like I was doing an impression of what I thought a good singer was. I wasn't just singing. And so it was causing all of this tension, not just like mentally, but physically in my voice, which is not healthy.
Right.
And so I would get really, really anxious about permanently damaging my voice by singing in this way, but I didn't know how to sing any other way. And so I just found myself like just running in circles. And so I just had to stop.
And I think that's a big part of the creative process because sometimes you run into those walls, right? And sometimes the walls are truly resistance and they're just trying to stop. They're trying to stop you.
Yeah.
And sometimes the walls are like lessons, right?
Right.
Or they're like massive, like desperately trying to get, there are just these I don't know what you call them, but there are these things that are like, you need to pivot now.
Yeah.
Like, you need to pivot right now because
Right.
something's not aligned.
Yeah.
And I think a big part of the creative journey is learning to know the difference, between resistance and like the signal to pivot.
Yeah.
And of course you didn't know it at the time,
Yeah.
but I think the amount of physical tension you were experiencing is always a big sign of probably a pivot.
Yeah.
So you make this pivot. You make
Yes,
this pivot into writing.
Yes.
And then tell me how that developed, because you're writing, and then all of a sudden, was it you looked at yourself and you were like, I have a book? What was it that kind of like put two and two together in your head, or that, flipped the switch on that light bulb?
Yeah, I showed some stuff that I was working on. It was just a collection of essays. And I showed one of them to a friend. And I said, what do you think about this? And the essay was on singleness.
Right, because you were telling me you were just processing a lot of stuff through the lens of your faith at
exactly.
the time.
Yes. It wasn't for anyone. I was just writing to write, to process my faith and some other things I was struggling with, like pride and singing and all sorts of fun stuff.
Pride.
Right.
On a Wednesday morning,
really
dealing with pride.
Easy peasy, like not at all like devastatingly existential.
It's okay. There may be a day when you get a text from me, but it involves phrases like dealing with anger.
Yeah. So stuff like that. Yeah. But one of the essays was on singleness, and I showed it to a friend, and she said, I think that there's like a whole book in this. Because I showed her, I said, I have all of this stuff and I don't know what to do with it, whatever. But she said, this right here, this one essay, I think you could make into its own book, because I was touching on at least 1,000 different facets and nuances of what it is to be single, and especially from a Christian perspective. There's just so many different complicated facets in there. Yeah, so she said, I think this is a book. And I just started tinkering with it, playing around with a structure, not even a structure, actually, just themes, different things that I would talk about pertaining to singleness. And she was right. That is my friend Kelly, if she is listening to this.
Kelly.
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 Yeah.
Shout out to Kelly.
Shout out to Kelly.
I want to talk about two things based on what you just said. One,
Okay.
but the first one, and I know there's a lot here. We probably can't go into it right now, but
Okay.
this whole podcast is about getting to know you, right? Because you've been on the other side of the mic for so
Yes.
long, giving people a platform to tell their story. So now we're flipping the script and giving you a chance to tell your story.
Yes.
One thing that's pretty obvious about you is that your faith really is important to you.
Mm-hmm.
But I would love to know a little bit about how that came to be, because I feel like for most adult Christians, there's always a point, especially if you're living in the city or pursuing a creative field or independent, and more in the space we like to think, really truly think about things and understand like why your beliefs are your beliefs. There's usually a story, or like a moment behind that. And I've read some of your work, and I know that your faith is something that's very living. It's not just this set of beliefs.
Yeah.
It's something that you're engaging with every day and trying to apply to like different areas of your life, whether that's your blog post about makeup to, this more complex question about like love and relationships, right? Were you raised in a Christian home? How is this something that became a core part of your identity, or like how you view the world?
Yeah, I grew up in a Christian home. My parents are both Christians. My parents actually go to separate churches, which I did not realize was a weird thing until probably post-college, actually. I don't know. I never questioned it because my parents got married. Well, I say that my parents got married later in life. At this point in history, it would not be weird for me to say they got married at 30. But at the time, back, almost 40 years ago, it was later in life, quote unquote. And my dad grew up in the town where we live and had gone to his church for his whole life. My mom had and they both had really set down roots in their individual churches. Share a common faith, but my dad goes to the Methodist church. My mom goes to the Episcopal church, and they're like 2 blocks away, because it's the tiniest town. It's not the tiniest town. It's a very small town. I grew up in a Christian home. I bounced back and forth between the 2 churches, depending on I don't know, my phase in life. I was baptized at my dad's church, so the Methodist church. My brother is older than me. He was baptized at my mom's church. And yeah, so I've always been a Christian. I've always gone to church, whether it was my mom's church or my dad's church. And it's always, I would say the first time it got really personal for me, I was 15. I went to this Episcopal youth retreat. I was the only person from my church who went because it was like multiple churches were a part of it. I did not want to go.
I remember reading about this.
And like, I made it very, very obvious to everyone there that I did not want to be there. But everyone was so kind anyways. They were so kind to me. And I remember the first night there was this talk that someone gave, and it was on this idea of masks, like masks that we wear, kind of the face that we present to the world versus what's going on inside, or who we think we should be versus who we actually are. And it struck me as very, very a powerful moment for me. It was something I never thought of. And it made, the idea was that God sees past our masks. God sees past that, and he loves us for who we are deep, deep down, in the places that maybe we don't want to show to other people or even think about ourselves. And it made it very personal for me. It made my faith very, very personal. And so my life has been a series of moments like that where I wouldn't say that I wasn't a Christian before, because I definitely was. There was this new piece of the puzzle that I got, that was handed to me, that I got to bring into what I already knew, which is the exciting thing about faith, that there's just so much there, right? And if you like, for me, being a Christian and reading the Bible and getting to know God and getting to know Jesus, it's just like a never-ending trove of, once I feel like I have a really solid grasp on it, God's like, here's this other thing that I think you need to consider, which can be very, very frustrating, but also pretty cool.
Yeah.
Like, it's a good thing that God is bigger than what I'm able to comprehend, because I'm not even the smartest person in the world, let alone, like, so it's good that he's bigger than that. I would say it's just gotten more and more personal, and there have been times when I've been kind of over God. I knew he was real and I believed in him, and I was like, he probably loves me or whatever. I just thought he was kind of a jerk. And for whatever reason, I'm still here, and I don't think it has as much to do with me as it is him just like consistently bringing me back and telling me new things about who he is and showing me new things about who I am in relation to him. And it's just, I'm sort of in one of those seasons where I'm just asking a bunch of questions, and I'm like kind of mad at him most of the time. But I'm still here.
Yeah.
And I mean, where else would I go?
Yeah.
Is kind of how I see it.
Yeah. And that's such a beautiful moment when you realize that there's a difference between having beliefs, right, and experiencing that really personal presence and that personal.
Right.
I don't even know how to explain it, but it's. We hear the phrase so much. Oh, it's a personal relationship,
Right.
But then you really think about the physics of a relationship, and it's a lot. It's a lot of in your business, asking hard questions, holding you accountable, like loving you when you don't feel very lovable, like the same exact physics that we apply to human relationships happens in your relationship with God, like if you're really open to it. Yeah. And I've kind of like the past year definitely been in that place of like, whoa, like A, I didn't know this is what I was getting myself into. B, this is awesome. And then C, definitely those like, I'm not going to talk to you for a week moments.
Yeah, right.
So what was it about this specific time, going back to your story, where you've kind of like pivoted away from singing or walked away from it, at least that's how it felt in your mind, I'm sure. And then you start all of this writing. What was it about your faith specifically that was something you wanted to write about?
I think that I was in a season, I kind of still am, where I was actually giving myself permission to ask some questions that I took for granted previously. Maybe it was a product of being in New York. It's a very different environment than growing up in the South, where everyone is just, there's so much about faith that you take for granted because it's just there. It's just an assumption, and you don't necessarily push past some of those assumptions to like, okay, God is good, but what does that mean? God loves me, but what does that actually mean? And what does that actually look like? And what in my life has kind of misrepresented that love? And yeah, so I was asking a lot of questions that I hadn't asked before.
Yeah, that's a really good question. The last one you mentioned, what in my life has misrepresented that love? And that's not a question that many people come to. You know, that idea that like this love is real, but the way it gets filtered down into our human experience, it must go through really broken filters. And I think so often we rationally turn away from that love because the filters it came through just made it look so bad.
Yeah.
You know?
Right.
And I think part of being a mature, thoughtful, question-asking Christian now is being willing to go back and say like, am I throwing away the love?
Yeah.
Because of the broken filter, or can I split the two again? You know,
Yeah.
and rediscover what that love really is and what it really means. So you're going through this phase, you're asking all these questions, and then you're wrestling with this through writing. And one of the things that comes up for you is singleness.
Yeah.
Walk me through that a little bit. Like, what was it about singleness that just, you know, really spoke to you as something you when you sat down to write that piece? You know, what were you thinking about just with your life and your story and who you were? Like, what was it about your experience up until that point that just made this that, you know, that piece, you know, that felt like it really, you know, it sounds, I haven't read it, but it sounds like it really came from your heart.
Yeah.
What were you processing in that essay?
So this piece, I was putting together just some thoughts, and it was mainly from a comedic, like kind of lighthearted perspective, which a lot of my writing is, just kind of looking at a concept and seeing what is absurd in it and pointing that out. And so for me, I felt like I grew up in the South, and I felt all of this pressure as a woman, and even as a Christian woman, this pressure to be married. And I didn't want to be married. Not that I'm anti-marriage, because I'm not. And if it does happen, that'd be great. But it's not something that I'm living my life for, per se. And I thought it was very strange that I felt this pressure when I didn't even want this thing. And I met so many women who really, really, really want to be married, and I wondered what kind of pressure are they feeling? Like, how much worse is this experience for them? And it was pretty heartbreaking for me to think about. And so I, at first, was coming at it from a perspective of convincing people, like, it's okay if you're not married. And, like, that is part of it still. I think it was a little bit more of a, I don't know, an aggressive stance, like, no, I don't want to be married, and I am living my life like I'm not going to get married, and everyone should live their life like I'm living my life. And so it was just a piece that was asking some questions about why we put this kind of pressure on women. And yeah, why did I feel like there was something wrong with me because I wasn't, you know, living in, like, waking up in the morning expecting to meet my husband.
Yeah, because it sounds like you were at a time where you were doing a lot of just identity.
Yeah.
Like looking at the different pillars of your identity, right? Yeah. Especially through the lens of being a Christian. And one of them that had been more or less just you had been immersed in for so long was this identity of Christian, woman, equals married.
Yes.
And in this piece, you decide to take that to bat, more or less.
Yeah.
So you share it with your friend. She says, "Hey, there's a book in here. What's the next step for you? Tell us more about the process around that."
Yeah, so I thought about some different topics that I would want to cover. I started reading other books that had been written on singleness. I talked to my friends. And what really started to take shape, it's been so many different iterations, this book, which is part of writing a book. But I wanted something, I realized in my research that every single person, every single person is coming into this conversation with very different and specific expectations and filters and lenses. Everyone was bringing something slightly different to the conversation, and yet we were all trying to have the same conversation, but with like astronomically like different variables and assumptions that we were each holding. And so I wanted to write something that went below all of that went past that, and it's trying to shift the conversation from these like cliches of, 10 steps to live your best single life, which there's a place for that. But what I was more interested in is those lenses, those experiences that we bring to the table that shape how we think about singleness and how we think about marriage. And the book is, in its current iteration, is a very personal look at that for me.
So you make another pivot at this point. At first you were pursuing the book, and then tell us about the 2 pivots you made.
Yes. So as a first-time author, and especially an author of nonfiction, I needed to get published. I realized that I needed to establish an audience and a following, sort of gain credibility. So I started with a blog because it was the easiest to get off the ground. Took a month to develop my website and started blogging weekly, and just writing as much as I could, because that's how you get better, is you just keep writing and have people look at it. What I really, really wanted to do from the get-go was the podcast. It's just a lot more difficult there's just a lot more moving pieces. So I started with the blog and then started working on this project, the podcast.
And tell me what was it about podcasting? Because it's not easy. It's an extremely social, extroverted process,
right?
Which I know are not your two. Are not 2 of your top strengths.
They're not 2 words that would describe me. No.
It's vulnerable. It's it takes a lot of work to pull it together. So what was it that compelled you though to keep pursuing that, even though it'd probably be safer to just go hole up at a cafe somewhere and just blog?
And just blog forever and ever and ever. Yeah. So much of the conversation about singleness is happening apart from actual real life singles. And so for me, it just made sense to create something that was giving the microphone to people who are actually single and asking them about their real everyday lives and their faith and what's hard and what's great and their friendships. Just to hear about their lives, to say, hey, these people are out there and they exist and they have so much wisdom and so much depth. And they're pursuing their faith just like anybody else. It just, looks a little bit different than someone who's married, but it's just as deep and rich. And it has its joys and it has its challenges.
And I know earlier you were saying, as you were doing your research, you were noticing there were so many different perspectives on this.
Yeah.
And it seemed like podcasting for you had a lot to do with giving a space to honor that diversity of thought.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And that's something that I've tried to do is get a diversity of thought and a diversity of perspectives. Like interviewing someone who's been divorced and people who are never married. Yeah, that was really important to me from the get-go, for sure.
So the name of the podcast is called Unsuitable.
Yes.
Tell me the backstory behind that. How did you get that name? Why did you settle on that?
Yeah, unsuitable. I love that word. It's something that I kind of stumbled into as I was working on my book, even just like the first chapter. Well, the current first chapter. And yeah, thinking about my life and the person that I am, I have some like social anxiety, some like weirdness, and it's given me this sort of unsettled feeling like out of place wherever I am. And yeah, a lot of that is because of some past relationships and various things. Growing up as someone who's not especially girly in the South, where everything, I mean, like, I have stuff that's monogrammed and like stuff that's pink, but you know what I mean? Like, it's just like so entrenched there and feeling like, and I'm like sarcastic and introverted and all this stuff. Whereas a lot of the people that I grew up with were not like that, which was fine for them. It's just, I had this like weird kind of disjointed experience, which, I mean, now that I am exploring it more, I realize is a product of insecurity in some places. But then there's some times when it was a legitimate, like, no, I don't know what my place is here.
Yeah.
So that's the word that I stumbled onto to just capture that kind of restless, not quite, something's like a little bit off about me being here. I'm a little bit ill-equipped for what I'm being expected to do.
And it has multiple layers for you.
Yeah.
Because it's unsuitable not just as a woman.
Yeah, unsuitable as a woman, unsuitable as a wife and a mom. Like, I'm not a kid person, right? So there's that layer. Like, I didn't babysit at all growing up. It, like, stressed me out a lot. Anyways, you know, and then, like, yeah, just every aspect of...
And then your creative
everything.
career, you felt like you were experiencing so much. You were picking up so much of the same message. You know, unsuitable. You're not fitting. You don't fit.
Yeah.
I read your blog post about your experience in theater as a young child.
Yes.
With being larger than lots of your peers, your
Farm
female
strong.
peers. Farm
Shameless
strong.
plug. Shameless plug. I'm very proud of that blog.
I won't forget that opening line. I was born with toned calf muscles.
Yes. I'm very proud of that opening line.
You should be. It's a great opening line. I haven't forgotten it.
Thank
so
you.
that should be a good
something.
That's good evidence.
But yes, there are lots of layers. To it for me.
Which I can definitely relate to. You know, for various experiences I've had too, just having that feeling of like where do I fit?
Yeah.
Or having people straight up tell me specific reasons why guys weren't asking me out.
Right.
And you just collect those and you file them away.
And
then, you know, once every quarter when you're like, why am I single again? You go back and you look and you remember the reasons.
This is my
like,
file cabinet of reasons that I am unsuitable as a girlfriend. Yes. Yep. Yeah.
So you start your podcast asking people, you know, tell me about a time when you felt unsuitable.
I do. Yes.
It's your turn.
It's my turn. Yeah. So I had a date today and
Getting real.
I am not somebody who has dated much historically. This was my second date with this person. My like fourth date in the past 10 years. So, yeah. And you know, he was a really nice guy, and we had brunch and just talked. And you know, I don't know if this happens to you, but for me, when I'm feeling very socially uncomfortable, I have this like out of body experience where I just can't stop talking. I just can't stop talking, and I don't know what I'm saying, and it just like is all coming out of my mouth, and I'm like, what are you doing? And then all of a sudden, I've been sitting there just jabbering away for like 2 hours. I'm like, who am I? This is not a good representation of me. Anyways, so yeah. So dating is not something that I do. I joined a dating app. This was one of these situations like we were talking about earlier where I like just have all of this anxiety and I'm like, I just need to do it. I joined a dating app, and because dating became this like huge thing that I was just like so terrified of. And I was like, this is absolutely ridiculous. I can't even like talk to guys without like thinking 20 steps ahead. I need to do something to change this because this is absolutely absurd. It's just a date. It's not like the rest of my life. It's just a date. So I joined this dating app, and I find myself feeling very unsuitable in the sense that I don't have like a background of experiences to draw from to know how I'm supposed to behave on a date and like how I'm supposed to assess a date. And I don't even know that I have the vocabulary. I like shortly before you got here, I was talking to my friend Kelly again, who helps me process all of these things. I was talking to her and I was trying to describe like this feeling that I was having of where I was like, I can't put my finger on it. There was something that was just like kind of not, I wasn't totally into it. And I don't know if it was because of me or if it was like something I was picking up from him. I just didn't have the words. And finally we found the words. But yeah, in just assessing whether or not I want to go on another date with this guy, I was like, I don't even know how I'm supposed to do that. I don't know what I'm having for breakfast tomorrow. I truly do not, actually. Real talk. I think there's some oatmeal in the cabinet. Okay, that's fine.
And, I mean, but listening to your story, I think a lot of times, I mean, so it just highlights there's two sources where you get this feeling of unsuitability from, right? There's from the outside, where people either explicitly or non-explicitly telling you why you are not suitable for the dating world. Right. Or it comes from yourself, where you're analyzing your own experience and your own behavior so much that you declare yourself unsuitable or just whatever feelings you've had. You know, they're just so amplified that it almost seems to just paralyze you, even if the other person thinks you're perfectly fine. Yes. Which I can relate to both. Yes. Very, very well. But at the end of the day, there's some sort of expectation you're failing, whether perceived or real. Right. You know, which is a big thing of what this whole conversation is about. This is what the conversation you're trying to facilitate with the blog, with the book, with the podcast. It's like, what are those expectations?
And where do they come from? And why do we have them? Yeah. Yeah. Especially as like Christians, where, I mean, they just let anybody in. Yeah. I mean, if you look through the Gospels and then Acts, you know, it's just like all of these random people and there's no rhyme or reason. They're just people who like want abundant life. Yeah. Right. And that's what it is.
And I think part of what you're doing is in a way you're validating the desire for companionship and marriage. Right. Which I think a lot of people, when they think about people who write about singleness, you know, that might not be the first thing that pops into their mind. Right. But also, too, there's no Acts chapter 37. I don't know how many chapters there are in Acts, but I'm just 28. Making this up. Okay, cool. So my example works. You know, there's no Acts 29 with the header, how to date as a Christian, all the rules you need to know. Right. So in a way, this whole conversation about expectations, it extends into the church because there really is no clear guide. You know, there's no, it's all a matter of interpretation, right? And interpreting God's character and interpreting what it means to be a human and then interpreting what it means to have this desire, to be sexual, right? And trying to figure out how do we synthesize all of those.
Yeah. And if you look at church leadership, they're all married. Yeah. And so they don't even necessarily, not intentionally, just by nature of their experience, don't necessarily know they don't think about it because they're not living it and they haven't lived it, which again, that's fine. And there's like so many amazing resources for people who are married and people who have kids. But for people who don't fit into that, you know, there's a bit of a vacuum and a bit of a void. And as people are getting married later and later or not getting married at all, you know, like, what are we going to do about this?
Or even a lot of the traditional boundaries are starting to blur.
Yeah.
You know, a lot of the traditional definitions of things are starting to blur. And even for people who are married and in ministry, that's, you know, I'm sure they have their single phase too, but I think what you're saying is, you know, our entire framework needs to change, you know, from filtering life through like pre-married and married, right?
Yeah.
Because I think a lot of the conversation about singleness is like, this is how to be okay until you get married.
Right, exactly.
And that's very different from, this is how to flourish as a single person, or
Right,
just as a person.
As a person. Yeah. So much of it, like so much of the conversation, there's this implicit undercurrent that singleness is a problem to be solved.
Or a phase.
Right. Implying that it's a waiting room. It's something, you know, and that's just it's not fair, and it's not biblical, and it's so beyond the point of like living an authentic, meaningful Christian life.
Yeah. And just going back to what you said of like people want to live abundantly.
Yeah.
You know, and like how do you create a conversation about, and in a way that honors the desire perhaps that some people have for meaningful marriages, right? Like how do you honor that, you know, and how do you hold those two at the same time? Like it's almost like you're starting a conversation about holding two things that seem to be exclusive, how you can flourish both completely and entirely as a single individual,
Right.
without treating it like a waiting room,
Right.
and yet validate the desire to be married.
Right. I mean, for me, it's sort of analogous to how we talk about the kingdom, right? Because the kingdom invaded earth when Jesus came, right? So the kingdom is here and now, but it's also not yet. It's both of those things at the same time. Things that are not exclusive to marriage, right? Like deep and intimate relationships that are like not sexual, right? Like deep and fulfilling friendships and very, very real community are available outside of marriage. And by the way, if you're married, you also need those types of relationships. Right. And so for me, it's more about what do we need to do to cultivate a culture of transparency that's going to be beneficial for both marrieds and singles. Because if we're all up here talking about singleness and marriage, like singleness is a problem. If we're up here talking about marriage like it's this end-all be-all thing, there's just so much underneath that's more real.
Yeah.
That's more authentic.
And I think in Christian language, we would call that sanctification.
Right.
Which can happen if you're married or
Right.
if you're single.
Right.
And which
Yes.
probably needs to be the driving conversation in our head.
Right.
You know, it's not, am I married? And if you're married, when do I get single? If you're single, I had that backwards. If you're walking around and you're a single Christian, you're like, oh, when am I going to be married?
Yeah.
And if you're married, it's not like, whew, got married, not single anymore. That's over. I think, it's like, I am human. I am, loved by God.
Yeah.
And I've been called to become holy.
Yeah.
And these other things are tools on that journey.
Right.
And singleness can almost be just as, I don't know if I'll get in trouble for saying this, but in my case, I've definitely experienced a lot of transformation happening from being single, a lot of sanctification happening from being single. And I know there's a place for marriage as a sacrament, and I know that it's a truly blessed thing. So I'm not trying to necessarily equate the two in that way, but I am trying to say, like, at the end of the day, like, God is not waiting for us to get married to start making us holy.
Yeah. Right.
And I think what you're saying about let's just become more transparent, a more transparent conversation would be one in which we can talk about the language of becoming holy.
Yeah.
Whether or not we're married or single. Because if God's real and he's actually working in us, that work is happening. If we're going on dates and acing them, and if we're going on dates and
bombing it, whiffing it completely and totally. Yeah.
So you launched this blog in October. Mm-hmm. How many stories have you curated since then?
The podcast in October.
Did I say blog?
Yes.
You launched the blog. Just
blog in
take
June. 3.
Podcast. All right. You launched the blog in June. You launched the podcast in October. Mm-hmm. How many conversations have you facilitated now?
7.
And that's awesome.
Yeah.
I've also been in the same boat trying to start a podcast. I think I've done not 7. It's fine.
You're maybe being a little bit more methodical than I
we'll
was,
get there.
as we have previously discussed. That is not my strong suit. I'm just
But I'm sure it's been incredible to hear these stories,
Yeah.
to, see some more of these
my gosh,
frameworks
yes.
and
Yes.
interpretation. I don't know. You've just been exposed to,
yeah.
probably more than the average person, just in terms of the diversity of thought that's
Yeah.
out there about singleness. Okay, if you had to get it down to your top three, what would you say are your top three insights?
My top three
about
insights.
singleness that you've learned.
My first insight is that I should ask my guests about singleness more directly. Yeah. That life keeps going, that life happens. Whether you're married or single, life happens. And the people that I interviewed are just the most amazing humans. And they're living their lives. They're not like held back by the fact that they're not married. They're like doing amazing stuff and wrestling with how to be a Christian in their current context, which just happens to be single. And they're doing it, It's not like we get a pause button where we get to figure everything out and like then we live our lives. Like, nope, it just keeps going, and they're killing it. They're doing it. They're wrestling with all of this stuff, and that was like so encouraging for me. I would say that's probably my biggest goal of season 1, was to just give this sense of you're not alone.
Yeah.
Which felt very basic to me and was pretty basic by design, just because the learning curve was so massive.
That could be the name of your second podcast. Basic by design.
Basic by design, yes. Yeah, I mean,
right.
the second thing.
I was going to say insight number 2.
Insight number 2. I really loved hearing about the relationships, like the beautiful relationships, past or present, in these people's lives. Particularly because most of them, I gave very few guidelines as to what type of relationship they could talk about, and most of them chose to talk about a really good friend. One person talked about his sister. But just the growth that they're experiencing and the depth that they're experiencing through those friendships is a very encouraging thing, and I think it's also somewhat rare.
Yeah.
To be pursuing that kind of intimacy outside of a romantic context.
Yeah.
Context. I don't know why that word is so hard.
Yeah. Friendship is definitely worth something. I mean, you could probably do a whole podcast on friendship.
Yes.
I'm pretty sure. Or
I did
an entire season.
15-part blog series on friendship.
Oh my gosh.
And that was like, I was like, I gotta calm down. I gotta like cut this off. Cause it's, we talk about friendship in the church in a way, in the sense of we talk about community. But phrasing it like friendship is really, I think puts it in a slightly different place.
Well, I think too, there's a lot more we can even be adding to the conversation about community, because when you're trying, to follow Christ, especially in a place like New York, one thing, I never forget sitting down with some girlfriends in the fall, and we were talking about we were having super serious conversations. Like, we were the kind of girls who looked at each other because we all got paired up in a small group at a church retreat. Mm-hmm. And the first word out of all of our mouths were like, yeah, we don't want to be here, and we do not want to be small talking. Yeah. And it was the best we definitely, I'm pretty sure, had the best conversations. We just all started off in a really honest, place. So when I say we were talking about our struggles and where we were with just life and God and city and careers and creatives and everything. And one of the things we were processing was like, how do you create endurance? How do you generate endurance for this journey you're on? Yeah. And we boiled it down to community, Oh
my gosh, yes.
But then, what are the practices of community that generates endurance?
Yes.
It's not small talk, I just have to say.
It's not small talk, no.
Something much deeper than that, and I think that's a space the church could be moving in more boldly for sure. Identifying, the habits that anchor true friendship and that constitute true community, so that you're generating courageous, you're generating endurance, and you're sending super courageous, rooted people out into the world. Mm-hmm. I think you're right. keep the series going, you know?
Yeah.
Like, keep exploring that. Okay, insight number 3.
Insight number 3, their lives are not defined by what they do not have. That being, meaning singleness isn't the biggest part of their identity. And I think, right, marriage by necessity takes up a lot of mental energy in terms of cultivating and maintaining the health of that relationship. But for people who are single, you know, it's not like that absence is taking up just as much bandwidth necessarily. And, you know, that's where that bandwidth and that energy is channeled into other things like career and friendships and, you know, volunteering and all sorts of stuff.
But I think you also acknowledge that, because I know we've talked about this, how one of the distinctions you're trying to make is not that single people don't think about being single.
Right. Because, yes, we do think about being single. I think about it an inordinate amount because I write about it. But if I was not writing about it, I don't know how much I would necessarily be thinking about it. But yeah, I mean, we are relational creatures. Yeah. And there is that sort of innate desire for companionship, but even more so, I think, for partnership.
Yeah.
That is alternately amazing and beautiful, but also terrifying.
Yeah.
Terrifying. Yeah. To have that like one person partnership.
Yeah. So we're talking about insights about marriage. What would you say? How would you say, like, you've gone on this journey? You're writing, you're reading, you're doing research, you're curating people's stories, you're creating space for them to talk about their perspectives. You're letting really like opinionated people co-host your blog for your podcast for one episode, which is in itself an act of pure courage.
Yeah. Thanks.
Just a couple more questions, but one, has anything changed about your view of singleness?
I started off from a pretty judgmental and defensive place with singleness. And we touched on this a little bit earlier, where I was like, no, we all need to just be fine with being single. Singleness is fine, and we're all fine, and it's going to be fine, and I'm great, okay? I'm very, very happy being alone, all right?
And you should be too.
And you also need to be okay
Put that
with
ice cream down.
Yes. It's just a very oh my gosh, bless my sweet little brain. So I started out very, very judgmental and defensive, I would say, about it. But in talking to people and having these conversations, it's really been eye-opening of like, actually, it is okay to want to be married and to hold on to that hope, but also live a full and abundant life as a single person. That is so much harder.
It's so hard.
It's so much harder than like barricading yourself and the singleness is amazing and you're going to like being here, or you can get out, right? Yeah. It's like, that's a lot easier.
Yeah.
You know, it's like heels dug in the ground kind of like stance. You're with us or you're against us.
Yeah.
But to be able to balance those two things is, I mean, so many of my friends are doing it so well.
And what a beautiful place to be in, because going back to what we were saying about sanctification, like what else teaches you courage and hope and patience and trust and so many other things more than the process of wanting something.
Yeah.
So, something that's good and beautiful and wanting it intensely and yet choosing to live fully with like what you've been given. Yeah. Like there's so much to harvest and the tension between those two things and they're beautiful, beautiful things.
Yeah.
But you're right. It is so hard to be available and open to being in that position. It is a lot easier to say like, no, I'm just either going to pout or I'm going to, really spend all my extra time working on my eventual marriage plans.
Yeah.
Or I'm going to, wrap myself in this identity as like ought to be, but not yet.
Yeah.
Right. And I think what you're offering is like an alternate vision, an alternate vision of flourishing that invites people to step into that tension, to say, no, let's learn how to hope and to want something.
Yeah.
But not make that or the absence of it the core of our identity. Rather, let's make courage the core of our identity, you know?
Right.
And
Right. For me, it's the idea of wanting and not having is very vulnerable, and it's not a position I want to put myself in. And yeah, so I was just really, really hesitant. And even when I'm learning to be okay with listening to people express dissatisfaction.
Yeah.
And to not put a blanket over it and say, no, you shouldn't feel that way.
Yeah.
But to say, hey, you feel that way. Let's talk about it.
Yeah.
Let's talk about why that is.
Yeah.
Let's talk about where that comes from. And I think that's, it's definitely a healthier
And it's
way
so
to handle
countercultural.
it. And
But it's so countercultural too. because-
countercultural, like in the culture, but also I don't know why I said
I don't know either.
I don't know. In actual real life culture, society, right? But in the church culture as well, we're not good at talking about dissatisfaction or grief or desire. Yeah.
But I also think like what you're identifying as like a new narrative of singleness as an hoping for, longing for, desiring, trusting for, and yet living abundantly, you know, even though that hasn't happened yet, but not even living without the yet anymore, just fully embracing like exactly where you are. Like that is super countercultural because so much about our culture is telling us you want it, you go get it.
Yeah.
You have a desire, you figure out the fastest, quickest way to satisfy it.
Yeah.
I just put a SH in the word
Satisfy.
Doesn't exist.
Satisfy.
Doesn't exist. Satisfy.
I don't know why.
It's way more fun to say.
Had a vision of like Marvin Gaye, like satisfy.
Ooh.
Why? That was weird. It's creepy. It's not what you meant.
Yeah.
At all.
Thank you.
Brain. Calm down.
But yeah, I think that's just that's a really beautiful invitation.
Thanks.
To anybody who's in that place, I'm in that place. It's like, and that's, I get so amped up about it. It's because it's a whole new space that I didn't even know existed.
Yes.
It's like, how about we talk about your desire as a thing and not worry so much about whether or not it's going to be met, but just spend time honoring it as a thing.
Yeah.
That's a weird space.
Yeah.
Super weird space.
It is. Yep.
But it's also kind of great. So we have now journeyed with you from North Carolina into that first studio where you sat down with your yoga mat and your keyboard and your artwork and you braved First Avenue and you sat in Central Park and eventually you got this job. You're going on interviews. You're going to classes. You fling yourself across the bed in the middle of doing straw exercises. You walk away from singing and you start this new journey towards writing and creating a place for people to share their stories about singleness and their identity as Christians and how these two relate to each other. And it's so cool to know your story and to see all these different threads and all these different turns and detours you've made. And there are a couple of patterns here, right? There's this anxiety that you struggle with, right? There's this, the cycle of like anxiety, and then really bold decision making, right? Which I'm sure is something you're still working through. But there's also this theme of courage where you're like, you keep doing these courageous things over and over again, even though you could retreat.
Yeah.
You could curl up.
I could.
But you don't.
Nope.
And
still here.
Why?
Yeah. Nothing else would work for me, I don't think. I mean, as much as I would love to curl up and like just stay in this apartment and whatever, it doesn't work. I've tried it, in different ways, in different seasons, just completely isolating myself and trying to just live a normal, whatever life, and it just doesn't work. And so I know about myself. I know that I have this fear and this anxiety that drives a lot. I mean, it's like constantly playing in the back of my head. I don't want that to define me. I don't want that to be the driving force behind the decisions that I make because I know that that's not where life is. I know that giving into that is not where I'm going to find this abundance. And, there's a lot to be said for feeling your feelings and like sitting with them And I think that that's a really beautiful place to meet God. But it's not in the wallowing, it's in walking into what the Lord has for me in spite of feeling so anxious and afraid. And that's where he is in the middle of all of that discomfort and fear, actively choosing, no, I am not going to be defined by this fear because it's not going to work. It's not going to work. My life would be so miserable if I chose to listen to my anxiety more than I listened to God.
Yeah.
And knowing that even though it doesn't always feel like it, he's there with me in it. Like he's not going to call me to this and just leave me hanging. That it's hard and it sucks so much. But that on the other side of it is new life. You know, it's like a bunch of tiny deaths and then a resurrection of newness and just more intimacy and depth with him and with myself and with people around me. That's why I, do what I do.
Thanks for listening to episode 8. We're going to take a couple of months to regroup and make things even better. If you want to keep up with what's going on, check Mary B's social media. Interested in making Mary B's book happen? Follow her on social media and head over to her website and subscribe to her newsletter. Every 2 weeks, she'll email you with exclusive content, updates, and direct links to the blog and podcast. That's all for now. See you in season 2.